July 2014. San Diego, California. Emily Carter stood at the edge of a life that never slowed down. 39 years old, working double shifts between a pediatric clinic and a hospital emergency unit, she had built a routine that left no space for collapse. Bills arrived with precision. Rent, insurance, groceries, medications. Everything demanded attention. Everything demanded money. And Emily had learned to answer every demand without hesitation. Her husband, Daniel Carter, had not learned the same rhythm. Once a disciplined man shaped by military structure, he had returned from deployment carrying something invisible and unmanageable. The official reports used phrases like chronic stress response and long-term adjustment disorder. Emily knew it as distance, silence, a gradual withdrawal from the center of their family. Their children had adapted in their own ways. Noah, 10 years old, quiet and observant, had begun to notice patterns that adults preferred to ignore. Lily, 8 years old, still held onto a version of the world where things made sense, where promises remained intact, and where a family trip meant happiness. The idea of the trip had come from a suggestion that sounded reasonable at the time. A change of environment, a break from routine, a chance for Daniel to reconnect with his children away from the pressure of daily life. Florida had been chosen because it felt manageable, domestic, familiar, safe. A coastal resort near Key West, advertised as quiet, family-friendly, and removed from the chaos of crowded tourist centers. Emily had planned to join them later. Her schedule did not allow immediate travel. A staffing shortage at the hospital made her presence necessary. The decision had been practical, logical, unavoidable. She arranged the bookings, confirmed the flights, packed for the children, and convinced herself that a few days apart would not matter. On July 17, 2014, Daniel left San Diego with Noah and Lily. Airport cameras captured a normal departure. A father guiding 2 children through security. A brother walking slightly ahead. A girl holding a small backpack decorated with bright patterns. Nothing in those images suggested disruption. Nothing suggested the last known moment of certainty. The first 2 days passed without incident. Emily received brief updates. Generic descriptions. The beach, the hotel pool, simple meals. Nothing detailed, but nothing alarming. The absence of detail did not seem unusual. Daniel had never been someone who narrated experiences. The third day introduced a shift that no one recognized at the time. That evening, sometime after sunset, Lily Carter disappeared. There was no clear timeline. No verified last sighting beyond vague statements. No confirmed direction. No immediate explanation. The initial report described a missing child from a secured resort environment. Staff confirmed no forced exits. Surveillance footage revealed gaps. Blind spots existed where certainty should have been. Emergency protocols activated quickly. Local authorities responded. Search teams covered the surrounding areas. Guests were questioned. Employees were interviewed. The timeline fractured under pressure, leaving only fragments that failed to align into a coherent sequence. Daniel's statement remained consistent in structure but empty in detail. He described a normal day. He described time spent near the water. He described returning to the hotel. He described Lily no longer being present. The repetition of normality created a pattern that investigators struggled to penetrate. Noah's presence complicated the situation. At 10 years old, he became both witness and variable. His account was limited, fragmented, shaped by confusion. He had been present. He had seen enough to understand that something had changed, but not enough to articulate what that change meant. Emily arrived in Florida the following morning. The moment marked a permanent division between 2 versions of her life. Before and after. Before, there had been exhaustion, responsibility, and pressure. After, there was absence. The search intensified with her arrival. Media coverage expanded. Missing child alerts circulated across multiple states. Volunteers joined organized efforts. Tips emerged and dissolved under scrutiny. Every possibility was explored. Every direction pursued. Days turned into weeks. Weeks extended into months. No confirmed sightings emerged. No credible leads produced results. The investigation transitioned from active search to long-term case status. Lily Carter became a file, a record, a name within a system that continued to accumulate unresolved stories. Emily refused to accept the transition. She extended her stay. She spoke with investigators repeatedly. She reviewed reports. She returned to locations already examined. She engaged with private search groups. She followed every suggestion, regardless of probability. Sleep became irregular. Work became distant. Time lost structure. Daniel changed in a different way. Where Emily moved toward action, Daniel moved away from it. His involvement in the search diminished gradually. He attended required meetings. He provided requested information. But the intensity that defined Emily's response did not exist in him. The difference created tension that remained unspoken but constant. Noah absorbed the environment silently. He observed the shift in both parents. He adapted to the absence of his sister without understanding its permanence. He learned to remain unnoticed during conversations that carried weight beyond his age. He learned that silence often replaced answers. By early 2015, the search had effectively ended. Officially, the case remained open. Practically, it had stalled. Emily returned to San Diego with a life that no longer resembled the one she had left. Lily's room remained unchanged. Personal belongings stayed in place. Photographs occupied visible spaces. The presence of memory replaced the presence of a person. The Carter family continued to exist, but its structure had altered in a way that could not be reversed. A single event contained within a single evening had removed certainty and replaced it with a question that did not resolve. And over time, that question would begin to take on a different form. Not disappearance, not loss, but something far more deliberate. 10 years did not pass for Emily Carter in a straight line. They accumulated in layers, heavy and uneven, pressing into every part of her life until there was no clear boundary between memory and the present. By early 2024, she no longer measured time in months or years. She measured it in routines that kept everything from collapsing. Phoenix, Arizona became the place where she rebuilt something that resembled stability. The move from California had not been about starting over. It had been about surviving financially. Rent had been lower. The hospital system had offered immediate work. The decision had been practical, made under pressure, and executed without reflection. Emily worked 2 jobs again, just like before the trip that changed everything. A morning shift at a small childcare center allowed her to maintain steady hours, and an afternoon shift at a regional hospital brought in the income that covered everything else. Healthcare benefits, utilities, food, transportation. Every dollar was assigned before it was earned. Every expense justified its place. Her schedule left no space for distraction. That had been intentional. Idleness invited memory, and memory never arrived gently. It came with precision, replaying the same questions without answers. Where had Lily gone? What had been missed? What should have been different? Daniel Carter lived in the same house, but his presence felt detached from the structure of daily life. His disability payments had been reduced years earlier after a reassessment of his condition. Appeals had been filed and denied. The system had reached its conclusion, even if his reality had not changed. Without consistent income or structure, Daniel's days became unanchored. Alcohol replaced routine. Time blurred into repetition. Responsibilities shifted entirely onto Emily, not through discussion but through absence. The distance that had begun after his return from deployment deepened into something that no longer resembled a partnership. There had been attempts at intervention, therapy sessions scheduled and missed, medication prescribed and left unused, conversations initiated and abandoned. Each attempt followed the same pattern: temporary acknowledgement followed by withdrawal. Over time, Emily stopped initiating those efforts, not because she accepted the situation, but because she no longer had the capacity to sustain them. Noah Carter grew into adulthood inside that environment. At 20 years old, He carried himself with a restraint that felt older than his age. He worked part-time at a local supermarket, contributing what he could while attending community college classes intermittently. His academic path had been inconsistent, interrupted by financial pressures and the weight of responsibilities that extended beyond school. Emily encouraged him to save his earnings, insisting that his future should not be compromised by their situation. It was one of the few boundaries she maintained firmly. Noah accepted the instruction without resistance, though he understood that the household depended on more than one source of income. The absence of Lily remained constant. Her room no longer existed in its original form. The move to Phoenix had forced practical decisions. Furniture had been sold. Items had been stored or discarded. But her presence had not disappeared. It existed in photographs, in digital archives, in the quiet references that appeared unexpectedly in conversation. Emily's search never stopped. It changed form over the years, adapting to new tools and platforms. Online forums dedicated to missing persons cases became part of her nightly routine. She reviewed posts, followed leads, cross-referenced details. Most information led nowhere. Some provided temporary hope before dissolving under verification. Still, she continued. The process had become ritual. After returning from work, after checking bills, after ensuring Noah had what he needed, she opened her laptop. Email notifications, message boards, archived case files. Each night followed the same sequence. Each night ended without resolution. Guilt remained present, constant and unresolved. It did not diminish with time as people often suggested. It evolved. Early guilt had focused on the decision not to join the trip immediately. Later, it shifted toward missed details. Conversations that could have been different. Questions that had not been asked. Emily understood logically that she had made decisions based on necessity. Work had been required. Income had been essential. But logic did not replace responsibility. It coexisted with it, creating a tension that never fully settled. Daniel's behavior introduced another layer of instability. His interactions became increasingly unpredictable. Periods of silence alternated with moments of agitation. Conversations, when they occurred, rarely progressed beyond surface exchanges. Any attempt to discuss the past resulted in deflection or escalation. Over time, those discussions stopped entirely. Noah observed these patterns closely. He did not challenge them openly. Instead, he adapted his behavior around them. He spent more time outside the house, extending work hours when possible. He limited interactions that might trigger conflict. His presence within the home became strategic, calculated to avoid unnecessary attention. The family existed within a shared space but operated independently. Communication reduced to essentials. Schedules overlapped without coordination. Meals occurred separately. The structure resembled coexistence rather than connection. Despite the distance, certain patterns persisted. Emily continued to ask Daniel if he had remembered anything new about the trip. The question appeared occasionally, framed carefully, delivered without accusation. The answer remained unchanged. Nothing new. Nothing different. The repetition created a closed loop that offered no progress. Over time, Emily began to notice inconsistencies. They were subtle at first. Minor variations in phrasing. Details that shifted slightly between retellings. Nothing definitive enough to form a conclusion, but enough to create unease. The original investigation had documented Daniel's statements, but those records existed outside her immediate access. What remained were her own memories of what he had said. The differences accumulated quietly. Emily did not confront them directly. Instead, she recorded them mentally, adding them to the growing list of uncertainties. Each inconsistency suggested that the past had not been preserved as clearly as it should have been. The possibility that something had been withheld began to take shape. It did not arrive as a clear accusation. It emerged gradually, built from repetition, from gaps, from the absence of detail where detail should have existed. Emily did not yet define it as suspicion, but the foundation for that suspicion was already in place. And as the 10th year approached its midpoint, the structure holding everything together began to show the first signs of fracture. Not from a single event, but from the accumulation of everything that had never been resolved. The morning Emily Carter overslept by 30 minutes in March 2024, she did not panic immediately. Panic had been part of her life for too long to arrive without warning. Instead, she recognized the mistake as something that should not have happened. Her phone alarm had been set. Her schedule had been clear. Her responsibilities had not changed. The failure came from exhaustion, not negligence, and that distinction mattered to her more than anyone else. At the childcare center where she worked part-time, absence was noticed quickly. Children required consistency. Parents expected reliability. Emily understood that better than anyone. When she arrived late, explanations were expected. She provided one that sounded structured and reasonable. A scheduling error, a missed alarm, a rare occurrence. The explanation was accepted, but not forgotten. Later that same day, during her hospital shift, Emily moved through her responsibilities with the same precision she had maintained for years. Patient charts were updated. Medication schedules were followed. Colleagues relied on her consistency because it rarely failed. Her performance remained unchanged, even when her internal state did not. This was how she had survived the last decade. Function first, everything else later. When she returned home that evening, the house felt as it always did. Quiet, divided, and occupied by individuals rather than a family. Noah had already left for his shift at the supermarket. His schedule overlapped with hers in a way that minimized interaction, not by design but by necessity. Daniel's presence was uncertain. Some evenings he was there. Some evenings he was not. When he was present, his involvement remained minimal. Emily moved through the routine she had built. Bills were reviewed, emails checked, messages scanned, missing persons forums opened. Each step followed the next without interruption. The sequence provided structure, and structure prevented collapse. The search for Lily had changed form over the years, but it had not stopped. Emily maintained profiles on multiple databases. She followed updates on unidentified persons cases. She reviewed reports from organizations that specialized in long-term missing children. Most of the information did not apply. Most of the matches were incorrect. But the process itself mattered more than the results. It allowed her to remain connected to the possibility that something had been missed. That night, while reviewing an archived forum thread from a case in Florida, Emily noticed something that did not align with her expectations. It was not directly related to Lily. It was a discussion about procedural errors in early investigations, specifically in cases involving resort environments. The thread detailed how surveillance gaps, staff turnover, and incomplete documentation often resulted in lost evidence. Emily read the discussion twice. Then she closed the laptop. The information did not provide a direct lead, but it reinforced something she had begun to suspect. The initial investigation into Lily's disappearance had not been as complete as she had believed. There had been gaps. There had been missed opportunities. And more importantly, there had been reliance on statements that might not have been fully accurate. Daniel's statements. The thought did not arrive as an accusation. It arrived as a possibility. Emily had spent years accepting the official version of events. Daniel had been present. Daniel had reported the disappearance. Daniel had cooperated with investigators. That framework had shaped everything that followed. But over time, inconsistencies had appeared. Small differences in wording, slight variations in sequence, details that shifted when revisited. At first, Emily had dismissed them as memory degradation. Trauma affected recall. That was a known fact. But the pattern had continued, and patterns demanded attention. That evening, Emily began to reconstruct the timeline from memory. She listed the key points as she remembered them. Arrival in Florida. First 2 days without incident. The third day, the reported timeline of Lily's disappearance. Daniel's explanation of events. Noah's limited account. The response from hotel staff. The initial search. As she reviewed each point, She identified areas where clarity had been lacking, times that had not been confirmed, locations that had not been precisely defined, movements that had not been independently verified. The more she reviewed, the more the structure began to weaken. It was not that the entire narrative collapsed. It was that certain parts no longer held the same weight. They depended heavily on a single source: Daniel. Emily did not confront him that night. She did not ask questions. She did not introduce the possibility that something had been withheld. Instead, she stored the information, adding it to the growing list of unresolved elements that defined her understanding of the past. Days passed, then weeks. The routine continued, but something had shifted internally. Emily no longer reviewed information passively. She began to compare, to cross-reference, to question. Each piece of data was evaluated against what she already knew, and more importantly, against what she had been told. Noah noticed the change. He did not ask directly, but he observed differences in her behavior. The extended time spent reviewing documents, the increased frequency of note-taking, the moments of stillness that suggested deeper processing rather than simple reading. He had developed the ability to recognize patterns early in life, and he recognized this one. Daniel remained unchanged. His routines, if they could be called that, continued without variation. Absence, return, silence, occasional interaction. The pattern repeated with little deviation. If he noticed Emily's shift in focus, he did not acknowledge it. The distance between them remained intact. One evening in early April, Emily returned home earlier than usual due to a canceled shift at the hospital. The unexpected time created an opportunity she had not planned for. The house was empty. Noah was at work. Daniel was not present. Emily moved through the house without intention, following no specific task. The absence of immediate responsibility created a rare moment of unstructured time. It was during this moment that her attention shifted toward something she had not examined in years: the master bedroom. Not because of memory, but because of neglect. The space had become functional rather than maintained. Cleaning occurred in segments, limited by time and energy. Certain areas received attention regularly. Others did not. Emily began with simple tasks: organizing surfaces, sorting through items that had accumulated over time. The process required minimal thought, allowing her mind to remain focused on the underlying questions that had been building. As she worked, she reached a point where routine actions intersected with something unexpected. A detail that did not belong. A difference that had been hidden within familiarity. And for the first time in 10 years, Emily encountered something that did not align with the version of the past she had been given. Not a memory, not a possibility, but a physical indication that something had been deliberately concealed. Emily did not move immediately after discovering the hidden seam beneath the mattress. The detail itself was small, almost insignificant in isolation, but it carried a weight that disrupted everything she had accepted over the past 10 years. It was not the existence of storage space that mattered. It was the deliberate effort to conceal it. The fabric had been cut and reattached with care, not professionally, but with enough precision to avoid casual detection. It was not something that would happen accidentally. It required intention, time, and a clear purpose. Emily understood that before she even reached inside. What she found did not create confusion. It created confirmation. Several photographs lay stacked together, all from the Florida trip in July 2014. The same trip that had been documented in official reports, the same trip that had been reviewed repeatedly by investigators, and the same trip that had produced no meaningful evidence beyond initial statements. These photographs had never been submitted. Emily recognized the images immediately. Daniel had taken pictures throughout the first days of the trip. That had been part of his routine. He rarely communicated, but he documented. The existence of photographs was not surprising. Their absence from the investigation was. She turned one over. On the back, written in faded ink, was a sequence of numbers. Coordinates. Not a description, not a label, not a date, just coordinates. Emily stared at them for several seconds before placing the photograph aside and examining the others. Some were blank. Others contained similar markings. Not all of them were identical, but enough repeated to form a pattern. This had not been random. Beneath the photographs, she found a smaller piece of paper. A phone number. It was not formatted in a standard domestic pattern. The country code indicated an international connection. That detail alone shifted the situation beyond anything Emily had prepared herself to confront. She sat still, processing the information in silence. For 10 years, the narrative had been simple. A disappearance. A failure of security. A case without resolution. That narrative had depended on the assumption that everything relevant had been shared. Now that assumption no longer existed. Emily did not panic. Panic required uncertainty. What she felt was something more structured. A realization that the past had been altered deliberately, and that the person responsible for that alteration had lived in the same house with her every day since. Daniel had known something. Not suspected. Not guessed. Known. The difference between those words changed everything. Emily gathered the photographs and the paper carefully, placing them into an envelope. She did not return them to their original location. She did not attempt to recreate the concealment. The discovery itself marked a point of no return. For the first time in 10 years, she had physical evidence that the original investigation had been incomplete because information had been withheld. She needed to verify the coordinates. Not because she doubted their relevance, but because she needed to understand what they pointed to. Without that context, the numbers remained abstract. With it, they could redefine the entire case. Emily used her phone rather than her laptop. She entered the first set of coordinates into a mapping application. The result appeared immediately, precise and undeniable. A location in the Florida Keys. The proximity to the resort where Lily had disappeared was not exact, but it was close enough to establish a connection. The coordinates did not point to a public area. They identified a less defined space, one that did not appear in standard travel descriptions. Emily checked the second set. The result aligned within the same region. A third confirmed the pattern. These were not random points. They formed a cluster. Emily understood what that meant. The photographs had not been casual documentation. They had been connected to specific locations. Locations that Daniel had recorded but never disclosed. She moved to the phone number next. The international code suggested that it was not local to the United States. That detail introduced another layer of complexity. It suggested communication beyond the immediate environment of the trip. It suggested coordination. Emily hesitated before calling. Not out of fear, but out of calculation. A call could confirm relevance, but it could also alert whoever was on the other end. She had no information about who that might be, or what their connection to Daniel had been. After several seconds, she pressed call. The line rang longer than expected. When it was answered, the voice on the other end did not identify itself. It did not ask for clarification. It did not respond with confusion. The tone suggested familiarity with receiving calls that did not require explanation. Emily did not speak. The silence extended briefly before the call disconnected. No follow-up attempt was made from the other side. That response provided more information than any conversation could have. The number was active. It was monitored. And it was connected to something that operated outside normal expectations. Emily ended the call and placed the phone down. The situation had escalated beyond uncertainty. This was no longer about inconsistencies in memory or gaps in investigation. This was about deliberate concealment of evidence tied to a specific location and an active contact. Daniel had not simply failed to provide information. He had hidden it. Emily considered her options carefully. Confronting Daniel directly would provide immediate answers, but it would also introduce risk. If he had maintained this secret for 10 years, there was no reason to believe he would respond predictably under pressure. Waiting carried its own consequences. Every moment that passed allowed for the possibility that the situation could change beyond her control. There was only one course of action that aligned with the reality she was now facing. Emily needed to take the evidence to the authorities. Not the local police department that had no connection to the original case, but the agencies that had jurisdiction over interstate investigations and long-term missing persons cases. She gathered the envelope, her phone, and the limited documentation she had compiled over the years. Before leaving, she paused. The house remained silent, unchanged from when she had entered. Daniel was not there. Noah was still at work. The decision she was about to make would affect both of them. But the alternative was no longer acceptable. Emily stepped out with a clear objective. For 10 years, she had searched for answers. Now, she had found something that demanded to be answered. Emily did not reach the police station. The decision had been clear when she left the house. The envelope remained in her possession. The coordinates had been verified. The phone number had confirmed that something active still existed beyond her understanding. The next step should have followed a logical path: report the evidence, transfer responsibility, allow the system to take over. But that path ended before it began. Daniel appeared in front of her before she could complete the process. The encounter was not accidental. It carried the weight of anticipation, as if her movement had been expected, as if the timing had already been calculated. There was no confusion in his presence, no hesitation, no attempt to understand why she was there or where she was going. He already knew. Emily did not speak immediately. The absence of words was not restraint, but recognition. The situation had crossed a boundary where explanations no longer mattered. What remained was intent. Daniel's attention moved directly to the envelope. That detail confirmed everything. There was no denial, no question, no attempt to dismiss the significance of what she had found. His awareness removed any remaining doubt about whether the hidden photographs had been forgotten or overlooked. They had been deliberately placed, deliberately preserved, deliberately concealed. Emily adjusted her grip on the envelope, not out of fear, but to maintain control over the only physical evidence she possessed. The action itself carried meaning, even without words. She was not willing to surrender it. Daniel's response shifted the situation further. The version of him that had existed over the past 10 years, withdrawn, unstable, detached, no longer defined the moment. In its place was something more focused, more controlled, more decisive. The change was not sudden. It had always been there, hidden beneath layers of silence and avoidance. Now it was visible. He redirected the situation with a clarity that left no room for negotiation. The direction he imposed was not framed as a request. It was an outcome that had already been decided. Emily understood the implication immediately. This was not about preventing her from going to the police. It was about containing what she knew. She did not resist openly. Resistance would escalate the situation without improving her position. Instead, she followed the imposed direction while maintaining awareness of every detail that might matter later. The route, the timing, the absence of witnesses. Every element contributed to a larger structure she needed to understand. They returned to the house. The space that had once represented stability now carried a different function. It became a controlled environment, one that limited access, reduced unpredictability, and isolated variables. Daniel's movements within it followed a pattern that suggested preparation rather than improvisation. Emily remained focused on the envelope. It was still in her possession, but its security was no longer guaranteed. Daniel's attention returned to it repeatedly, not with curiosity, but with recognition. He knew exactly what it contained. He knew its value. The moment he took it, the balance shifted completely. Emily did not attempt to retrieve it. The action would have failed. Instead, she observed what he did next. He opened it without hesitation. The photographs were removed, examined briefly, and placed aside. The paper with the phone number received more attention. Not because it was unfamiliar, but because it represented something that still existed beyond the room. Daniel did not react with surprise. He reacted with confirmation. That response clarified something Emily had not yet fully accepted. The evidence she had discovered was not new to him. It had not been forgotten. It had been maintained intentionally, likely revisited, likely used. The question was not whether he had hidden information. The question was why. Daniel's next decision provided part of the answer. He did not destroy the evidence immediately. He did not attempt to eliminate it or deny its existence. Instead, he gathered the items again and secured them in a different location, one that suggested ongoing relevance. That choice indicated that the photographs and the number were still connected to something active, something that required preservation. Emily processed that realization carefully. If the evidence still mattered, then whatever it connected to had not ended in 2014. It had continued. It had evolved. And Daniel had remained part of it. The implications extended beyond the disappearance of Lily. This was not an isolated event. It was part of a larger structure. Daniel's attention returned to Emily. The dynamic between them had shifted completely. The distance that had defined their relationship for years was replaced by direct control. There was no longer any attempt to maintain appearances. No effort to preserve the image of a broken but harmless man. What remained was intent. Emily understood that her position had changed. She was no longer searching for answers. She had become part of the situation that required control. The realization did not produce panic. Produced clarity. Every action from this point forward carried consequences. Every decision would influence not only her own outcome, but the possibility of uncovering the truth about Lily. She could not act impulsively. She could not react emotionally. She needed to remain present, observant, and deliberate. Daniel's next move confirmed the direction of his thinking. He introduced a new variable, a location outside the house. The decision was not explained, but its purpose was clear. Movement created distance from the point of discovery. It reduced the risk of immediate intervention. It allowed for interaction with whatever network the phone number represented. Emily recognized the shift immediately. The situation was expanding. What had begun as a hidden compartment in a mattress was now connected to something external, something organized, something that had remained active for a decade without detection. She did not resist the movement. Resistance would eliminate her ability to observe what came next. Instead, she followed, maintaining focus on the details that mattered. The route, the timing, the absence of communication, the precision of Daniel's actions. Every element reinforced the same conclusion. This had not been improvised. It had been prepared. And whatever existed at the end of this movement was not new. It had been there all along, waiting beyond the version of the story that Emily had been given for 10 years. Noah Carter had been preparing long before Emily discovered the hidden photographs. He did not think of it as preparation at first. It began as observation, the same way he had learned to survive inside a house that no longer functioned like a family. He watched patterns, tracked inconsistencies, and stored details that did not make sense. Over time, those details stopped being random. They began to align. His father's behavior had never returned to what it had been before 2014. That much had always been clear. But Noah did not focus on what had changed emotionally. He focused on what remained consistent beneath the instability. There were moments when Daniel was not just withdrawn or disoriented. There were moments when he was precise, focused, alert in a way that did not match the version of himself he showed every day. Those moments were brief, but they repeated often enough to form a pattern. Noah paid attention to those patterns. He noticed that certain days triggered those shifts, certain times, certain phone activity. Daniel rarely used his phone in front of others, but there were brief periods when he did, always followed by withdrawal or absence. The timing of those interactions mattered more than their content. At first, Noah assumed they were connected to addiction, to external contacts that reinforced the cycle Daniel had fallen into. But over time, the pattern became more structured than that. The intervals were too consistent, the responses too deliberate. Something else was happening. Noah did not confront Daniel directly. He understood early that confrontation would produce nothing useful. Daniel had built his behavior around deflection and control. Direct questions would only reinforce those patterns. Instead, Noah chose a different approach. He began to follow. Not physically at first, but through indirect observation. He noted when Daniel left the house, how long he was gone, what time he returned. He tracked the days when the pattern broke and compared them to the days when it remained consistent. Over months, the information formed a structure that suggested coordination rather than randomness. Eventually, observation was no longer enough. Noah expanded his approach. He used his phone to document times and locations when possible. He reviewed public records where he could, searching for connections that might explain Daniel's behavior. He looked for financial activity, any indication of income or transactions that did not align with what the family knew. The results were limited, but not empty. There were gaps. Periods where Daniel's activity could not be accounted for. Locations that did not match his stated movements. Contacts that appeared briefly and then disappeared. Noah did not yet understand what it meant, but he understood that it mattered. The turning point came months before Emily's discovery. Noah had followed Daniel to a location that did not fit any established pattern. It was not connected to work because Daniel had none. It was not connected to known habits. It existed outside the structure Noah had mapped. He did not approach directly. Instead, he observed from a distance, tracking duration and frequency. Daniel returned to that location more than once, each time following a similar pattern. Arrival. Limited time inside. Departure without interaction. Noah recorded everything. That location became the first external point that connected to Daniel's hidden behavior. It also introduced a new possibility. Daniel was not acting alone. The realization did not arrive with certainty, but with probability. The consistency of the pattern suggested coordination. The lack of visible communication suggested an established system. Noah needed more information, and to get it, he had to take a risk. He made contact. Not with Daniel, but with someone connected to the same network. The approach was indirect, cautious, and structured around anonymity. He used information he had gathered to identify a point of entry, someone who existed on the edge of whatever system Daniel was part of. The response confirmed what he had suspected. There was a network. It did not define itself openly. It did not provide details, but it acknowledged structure. It acknowledged continuity. And most importantly, it acknowledged Daniel. Noah did not reveal his identity. He did not need to. He presented himself as someone interested in access, in understanding the system, in participating if necessary. The response he received was measured, cautious, but not dismissive. That alone was enough. It meant that Daniel's involvement was not isolated. It meant that whatever had happened in 2014 had not ended there. It had continued, sustained by a structure that operated quietly, deliberately, and without exposure. Noah shifted his objective. He was no longer trying to understand what had happened. He was trying to stop it. The idea of going to the police had crossed his mind more than once. But each time he rejected it. Not because he distrusted the system entirely, but because he lacked concrete evidence. What he had were patterns, suspicions, and fragments. None of it would hold under formal scrutiny. And time mattered. If the network was still active, then delay carried risk. Not just for his family, but for others. Noah began to consider a different solution. One that did not depend on external intervention. One that operated within the same system Daniel had used. The contact he had established became central to that plan. Through careful communication, Noah introduced a new variable. He presented a scenario that aligned with the network structure. A request for resolution. A problem that needed to be handled. Daniel. The response was not immediate, but it was not rejected. That was enough to confirm that the network functioned on transaction, not loyalty. If Daniel had value, it was conditional. If he became a liability, that value could change. Noah understood what that meant. He could redirect the system against the person who had sustained it. The plan formed gradually, built from the same patience that had defined his observation. It required timing, coordination, and a willingness to cross a line he had never intended to approach. He justified it in a way that made sense to him. This was not revenge. It was prevention. If Daniel had been responsible for Lily's disappearance, then he remained a threat. If the network was still active, then that threat extended beyond their family. Stopping him would stop something larger. Noah moved forward. He finalized the arrangement without revealing his identity, using the same controlled communication that had brought him this far. The details were minimal but sufficient. A location, time, condition. The system accepted. The decision had been made. By the time Emily discovered the hidden photographs, the plan was already in motion. And Noah understood that once it reached its conclusion, there would be no way to undo what he had set into motion. But for the first time in 10 years, he believed he was moving toward an answer. Even if the cost would redefine everything that remained. The moment the structure began to break did not come from force. It came from interference. Noah's plan had been designed to move quietly, to follow the same patterns the network itself relied on. Minimal exposure, controlled communication, a single objective executed within a system that responded to transactions rather than emotion. Everything depended on timing and isolation. But isolation no longer existed. Emily's discovery had introduced a variable Noah had not accounted for. Her movement toward the truth had accelerated the timeline, forcing elements that were meant to remain separate into the same space. When Noah arrived at the location he had arranged through his contact, he did not expect to see Daniel already engaged within the same network structure. That overlap should not have happened. It meant that Daniel had initiated his own movement, independent of Noah's plan, but connected to the same system. The situation had converged. Emily was present as well, brought into the same environment by Daniel's decision to contain the evidence. 3 separate paths, all leading to the same point, none of them aware of the full picture until that moment. Noah recognized the shift immediately. The plan he had constructed no longer applied in its original form. The controlled execution he had prepared for had transformed into an unpredictable convergence of intentions. His objective remained the same, but the method could no longer rely on isolation. He did not reveal himself immediately. Observation remained his first instinct. He needed to understand how the pieces connected before making a move that could not be reversed. The individuals present, the structure of interaction, the hierarchy within the network. Every detail mattered. What he saw confirmed what he had suspected for months. Daniel was not peripheral. He was integrated. The interaction between Daniel and the others present did not carry hesitation. Carried familiarity, established roles, established expectations. The network did not treat him as an outsider, treated him as someone with a defined position. That realization reframed everything. The disappearance of Lily had not been an isolated decision made under pressure. It had been part of a system, process, something that extended beyond a single moment and into a structure that had continued operating long after. Noah adjusted his thinking. Stopping Daniel would not be enough. The system itself needed to be exposed. At the same time, Emily was processing a different realization. The evidence she had discovered had led her here, but what she encountered extended beyond anything she had prepared for. The coordinates, the phone number, the concealed photographs, all of it had pointed to a connection. But the scale of that connection had not been clear until now. This was not a hidden secret maintained by one individual. It was a network that operated with continuity. Emily's focus remained on one question: Lily. If the system existed, if it had been active for 10 years, then Lily's disappearance could not be viewed as an isolated loss. It had to be understood as part of that system. And if it was part of that system, then the possibility that Lily was still alive moved from distant hope to structured probability. That shift changed everything. Daniel's position began to weaken under pressure. The presence of both Emily and the network created a conflict he had not anticipated. His attempt to control the situation by isolating Emily had led him directly into a space where control no longer belonged solely to him. The network operated on its own logic. Loyalty was secondary to function. Value was determined by utility. Risk was managed through removal or replacement. Daniel had maintained his position for 10 years, but that position depended on stability. Now, instability had entered the system through exposure. Noah understood that dynamic. He had built his plan around it. The contact he had established moved within the same structure, observing the same shift. The presence of multiple variables increased the level of risk. The system would respond to that risk in a predictable way. It would identify the source. It would contain it. And if necessary, it would remove it. Noah stepped forward at the moment the structure reached its breaking point. The decision was not emotional. It was calculated. Remaining hidden no longer provided an advantage. Visibility allowed him to redirect the outcome. His presence introduced a new layer of disruption. Daniel recognized him immediately, but the recognition did not carry the authority it once would have. The environment had shifted beyond personal control. The network now held the dominant position. Noah's objective was clear. He did not engage with Daniel directly. He addressed the structure. The information he had gathered over months, the patterns he had identified, the contact he had established, all of it came into play at once. He introduced evidence not as accusation, but as leverage. He reframed Daniel's position within the network, shifting him from participant to liability. The response was immediate. The system did not require debate. It required assessment. Daniel's history, his actions, the exposure introduced by Emily, and the disruption created by Noah all combined into a single conclusion. He was no longer stable within the system. Emily watched the shift occur without interruption. For 10 years, she had searched for answers within the framework of a missing persons case. Now she was witnessing a structure that operated outside that framework, one that had taken her daughter and integrated her disappearance into something larger. But the same structure that had concealed the truth now faced exposure. An exposure-forced response. Noah held his position, maintaining control over the only element that mattered. Information. He had what the system valued. He had access, understanding, and the ability to disrupt further if necessary. That leverage allowed him to redirect the outcome away from irreversible violence and toward something else. Containment. Redirection. Transition. The system adapted. Daniel's control dissolved. Emily's search reached a point of convergence. And for the first time in 10 years, the truth was no longer hidden behind absence. It was present, structured, and ready to be revealed. The system did not collapse in a dramatic moment. It unraveled under pressure piece by piece as information moved from private control into structured accountability. Emily made the decision that changed everything. Instead of allowing the situation to remain contained within the network's internal logic, she activated external oversight. The call was not impulsive. It was the result of 10 years of endurance, of searching without answers, of confronting a truth that could no longer remain hidden. When she reached emergency services, she did not describe fear. She described evidence, coordinates, a phone number, a long-term disappearance connected to an organized structure. The response was immediate. In the United States, systems move differently when a case shifts from uncertainty to evidence tied to interstate and potentially international activity. Local law enforcement did not remain isolated. Federal agencies became involved. Information moved quickly through channels designed for exactly this kind of escalation. What had remained invisible for a decade was suddenly visible. Daniel's position ended in that moment. He was no longer a participant within a network that could protect him. He became a subject of investigation, defined by the evidence he had concealed and the structure he had supported. His history, his movements, his connections, everything became part of a larger case that extended beyond a single family. Noah's plan stopped where it needed to. He had initiated something he could not fully control, but when the structure shifted toward exposure, he did not resist it. He redirected his role, moving from execution to cooperation. The same information he had gathered to act independently became the foundation for formal investigation. He provided everything: dates, patterns, contacts, the location he had tracked. the communication he had initiated. Each detail added to a case that now had direction and momentum. The network responded as expected. It attempted to reduce visibility, to fragment, to isolate its own vulnerabilities. But systems built on secrecy often fail when confronted with coordinated oversight. The same structure that allowed it to operate quietly also limited its ability to adapt under pressure. Connections were identified. Records were traced. Communication channels were mapped. What had once been a hidden system began to take form as a case file, structured and defined, no longer protected by obscurity. And within that structure, one question remained central. Lily Carter. The coordinates Emily had discovered became the starting point. The phone number provided a connection. The network's internal records, once accessed through investigation, filled in the gaps that had remained empty for 10 years. Lily had not disappeared. She had been transferred. The event in Florida in 2014 had not been random. It had been part of an arrangement, facilitated by a system that operated outside legal adoption processes. Children were moved between locations, identities altered, records erased or replaced. The process relied on isolation, on gaps in oversight, and on individuals willing to participate. Daniel had been one of those individuals, not under pressure, not in confusion, by choice. The realization did not arrive as a single moment for Emily. It unfolded through evidence, through statements, through the structured language of reports that translated 10 years of absence into defined actions. Lily had been placed with a family in Georgia. The placement had not followed legal procedures. Documentation had been altered. Records had been constructed to support a new identity. The family involved had participated without full disclosure, operating within a system that presented itself as legitimate while bypassing regulation. But one fact remained unchanged. Lily was alive. When the information reached Emily, it did not produce immediate relief. It created a pause, a moment where 10 years of uncertainty had to be replaced with something real. Hope, which had been sustained without evidence, now had to exist alongside truth. The reunion was not defined by simplicity. Time had changed everything. Lily was no longer 8 years old. She had grown within a different identity, a different environment, a different understanding of who she was. The transition from one life to another could not be reversed in a single moment. But the connection remained. It existed beyond memory, beyond documentation, beyond the systems that had attempted to redefine it. Emily approached that reality with the same clarity that had carried her through the last decade. She did not expect immediate restoration. She did not expect the past to return. She understood that what mattered was not reclaiming what had been lost, but building something honest from what remained. Noah stood beside her in that process. He had come close to making a decision that would have defined his life differently. The path he had chosen had brought him to the edge of irreversible action. But he had stopped before crossing it, and that distinction mattered. Authorities recognized that. His cooperation, his restraint, and the context of his actions shaped the outcome. He faced consequences, but not the kind that would erase his future. Instead, he became part of the process that exposed the truth. Daniel's outcome followed a different path. The charges extended beyond a single act. Participation in illegal transfer, concealment of evidence, involvement in a broader system. His actions were not viewed in isolation, but as part of a structure that had caused harm beyond his own family. The system that had protected him for 10 years no longer existed. Accountability replaced it. The Carter family did not return to what it had been. That version of their life ended in 2014. What followed was something new, shaped by truth rather than absence. It carried weight, complexity, and the reality of everything that had happened. But it also carried something that had been missing for 10 years. Clarity. Emily no longer searched without direction. Noah no longer carried questions without answers. And Lily no longer existed as a name within a file. She existed in the present. The future did not promise simplicity. Healing did not follow a schedule. Trust did not rebuild itself automatically. But something fundamental had changed. The truth, once hidden, had been brought into the open not through destruction, but through the choice to face it. And that choice defined everything that came after. Because in a world where silence can protect harm and fear can delay action, the most powerful turning point is not the moment when darkness is exposed. It is the moment when someone refuses to let it remain hidden any longer. Thank you sincerely for taking the time to listen to today's story. Your attention and presence mean more than words can fully express. Stories like this are not only meant to be heard, but to be felt, remembered, and reflected upon. From this story, we are reminded that truth may be hidden for a long time, but it never truly disappears. Courage, patience, and the willingness to face reality can eventually bring light into even the darkest moments. No matter how difficult the journey is, choosing honesty over fear and compassion over anger can change the outcome of a life. We also learn that every decision carries consequences, and even in the most painful situations, there is always a chance to stop, to rethink, and to choose a better path. What matters most is not how long we have been lost, but whether we are willing to find our way back. If you found meaning in this story, the best way to support our channel is very simple. Please take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing more meaningful and powerful stories to you. Once again, thank you for being here and for listening.